presentation. There you go.
Great, thanks everybody. Thank you, Ira. Hopefully you can all hear me and see me, and I will try to make sure this is working right. So thank you so much. One quick note before I start too. I'm sorry to say that Jonathan Dawson won't be able to join me today. He's very ill with a fever, and so couldn't join. But I will try to do a little bit of justice to his chapter, but more broadly, we'll introduce the broader themes of State of the World 2017 on Earth Ed, and maybe about halfway through, take a little break to have some question and answers before moving on to the special section in the report on higher education. So I wanted to kind of achieve two goals today: talk more broadly about what Earth education could look like, but also specifically higher education. And before diving in, I do want to just start by talking about climate change. I know we talk a lot about it, but I really want to set some context for this project, for this idea of Earth Ed. I mean, if we really start to look at where climate change has brought us, and this quick video graphic is showing how hot it's gotten. And if we click over to 2016, it's even hotter, of course. And the record temperatures that we're hitting is completely transforming our futures, right? The state of the planet, of course, but things are changing so quickly that it's naive at this point to believe that we can stop climate change. We've locked in at least 2 degrees Celsius of temperature increase, and realistically, probably much more. And the new data that just keeps coming out, like this recent article in Yale E360 by interviewing Jennifer Francis, she's noticing that some days are exceeding 20 degrees Celsius over the whole Arctic, right? So the temperature increases that we're talking about, combined with the population increases that are projected for 2050, we're expecting 9.6 billion people by 2050, and that's not even the peak anymore. The UN revision suggests that it will keep growing beyond that. So when we have this many people using this much carbon and no real strategy to stop it, maybe to slow it through things like Paris, but when you have these massive changes, we have to expect a very different future for the students in school today. Right? When scientists are saying that the collapse of the Western Antarctic is now no longer stoppable or is unstoppable, yes, that's going to take a century, 2 centuries, maybe 3 centuries, maybe less if we don't start stabilizing emissions. But we're talking about a massive difference in the future, whether we're talking about massive droughts, whether we're talking about coastal flooding and sea level rise, whether we're talking about mass migration. There is much evidence now that Syria is partially due to drought and climate change, and that's one country dealing with civil conflict pushing on the borders of Europe. What happens when another billion Africans are added to that the continental population, and there's much more disruption? What kind of political fallout will come from climate change then? And the worst part, of course, is that the leadership of arguably the most powerful country in the world doesn't even accept that climate change is real. And it's not just, of course, Donald Trump, but his whole cabinet. And not a whole cabinet, but there are 9 that I've counted climate denialists in the Trump administration at high levels. And so when you have this level of denial and this level of dismantling of environmental policies already in the first few months, what does that suggest is the path forward? And as Ira noted, I focused first, over the many years, one of the dominant themes of my work has been on this idea of consumption, consumerism, and specifically transforming cultural norms away from high consumption, high growth lifestyles and economic pathways. And in 2010, the Transforming Cultures, the State of the World looked at transforming cultures and specifically 6 key institutions on how to shift cultures toward a culture of sustainability. And of course, not surprising, one of those institutions was education. And so this year, we really wanted to unpack that. There were a few chapters talking about the power of education, but not at the depth that it deserved. And partially because I want to unpack that, partially for personal reasons. I have a 5-year-old son, and I'm trying to figure out what he needs to know going into this turbulent century of his and ours. I really wanted to focus State of the World this year on Earth education. And why Earth education? Why not just education for sustainability or environmental education? I don't think that's enough anymore. I think we have to accept, because of the changes that I just noted, because of the lock-in of climate change at a significantly disruptive level, we also have to factor in education for resilience. So the ideal education moving forward is education for sustainability and education for resilience. So that optimal merging of the Venn diagram is what I would argue is Earth education. When you have educational curricula and projects and priorities that actually improve both the resilience of students and increase their sustainability leadership. And so that's where we kind of focus this the first half of the report is really focused on this question of, okay, well, what does that mean? What would Earth education core principles look like? And so we mapped them out is to the best of our abilities, arguing that at the foundational level, at the bottom of a Maslowian kind of pyramid, we have Earth dependence. And then on top of that is interdependence. You know, how do we, without conflict, live 9.5 billion of us? How do we then also become more creative so that we can actually respond healthily and effectively to crises that we've never encountered before as a species? And on that, how do we learn to learn? What is called deep learning in artificial intelligence terms, the ability to apply the learning from one sector to another. And finally, well, actually one more on the side here is that of life skills. And I didn't integrate that into the pyramid directly because they weave through almost every other element, every other priority, and are as important as ends as means, right? If we don't have children that have basic life skills, well, when the consumer economy starts to erode, they'll be in deep, deep trouble. But when you have all 5 of those, they at the pinnacle, at the equivalent of Maslow's self-actualization pinnacle, you have Earth-centric leadership. True leadership where youth and students are actually working and applying all that they've learned to help heal the Earth, help protect the Earth, help restore the Earth in ways that improve human well-being as well as ecological well-being. So for this first half of the webinar, I just want to go through each of those 6 elements, each of those 6 priorities, and highlight some of the great research that came out of the report, out of the different chapters in the book. On Earth dependence, I think the opening chapter after the introduction is by David Sobel, who looks at forest education, at nature preschools, and the deep value of these. You know, that's forest kindergartens are pretty common in places like Germany and Scandinavia. In Germany, there are over 1,000 forest kindergartens. In the US, there are far, far fewer. But the research shows that if you take children and you put them in the woods, no classroom, no building, for the first 2 years of their education, it improves their, obviously improves their nature awareness and connection, but it also improves things like executive functioning. They become more self-confident, there's an intelligence boost, there's a real opportunity in giving them both skills and broader self-awareness and an ability to be self-driven and things that we would be shocked at are part of the normal curriculum, right? Playing with fire, whittling with knives at 5, 6 years old, climbing trees, all out of the view of the two teachers that are typically there with the 20 students, right? So, they're downhill, they're playing in brooks, they're all muddy, they're in the cold, they're in the heat. It's all very normalized that they're just part of this natural system. And that is, I think that right there should be the future of education for all young children. But I think excitingly, that's kind of the opening salvo, if you wish. And then we talk about eco-literacy and the importance of understanding the environment and environmental systems. I think those are obviously complementary. We want the intellectual understanding of the environment, but we also want that emotional connection that can come from something like a forest preschool. There's a chapter on Indigenous education, which at the one level is talking about Indigenous skills. These images here on the screen are a woman collecting tula reeds and then making a tula canoe out of them. But there's not just talk about Indigenous skills in that chapter by Melissa Nelson, but actually talk about the value that Indigenous education can offer to us during this time of transition. She made a really interesting point that I hadn't heard before, that Indigenous peoples essentially lived through a dystopia these last 200, 300 years. The things that we were worried about, they have already gone through. And there's something to be learned from that, something to learn of how to survive with one's character intact, with one's self intact, even as horrific things are brought upon you. So for both the knowledge that could be very useful in times of transition, but also the wisdom, it's a really important element of Earth dependence education. As Indigenous skills are very important to me, I've been prioritizing that in my own son's education. Here he is actually breaking open acorns. We processed acorns this fall and then made them into flour after we ground them up, leached all the tannins out, which are toxic. Only squirrels can stomach that. But once you leach out all the tannins, then you can actually make a really nutritious flour out of them. And so trying to really embed Indigenous skills in my own son's education from early on. Moving on to interdependence, this again, the next layer, once we understand our complete dependence on the earth, we also have to understand our interdependence with each other. And that manifests in the book in 2 chapters, one on social emotional learning, which I think is in vogue in a sense right now. There's a lot of conversation around the value of social emotional intelligence and actually actively teaching that. And then also on character education. And character education has remained somewhat peripheral, but is very important, I would argue, because character education happens no matter what, right? So if you don't teach character education, that you still model a certain set of moral values to your students. And so making it intentional, making the teaching of character intentional is an essential element. And our author on that really goes into some great examples from schools around the world that really prioritize moral education, whether that's inter-age mentoring. Right? The picture, one of these pictures here is an older boy helping a younger boy teach with his schoolwork and teaching, which really builds a kind of a leadership and a kind of those relationships. There's opportunities to teach about moral exemplars from around the world through history, and really work with teachers and students to cultivate schools of character, right? To help show the leadership, moral leadership of those schools. So, I think, for me, it's a natural to really cultivate character education, social emotional learning, and creativity too. I mean, it goes hand in hand with being outside and playing, whether that's in the forest or this is an image of a junk playground, as they're called, just kind of half built with lots of stuff to play with and out of place, rather than the very overly safe kind of plasticized playground that we typically see nowadays. But just having more opportunity to play is an essential part of developing as human beings. As David Whitebread, the chapter author on play, really makes clear. He has a very strong case for the correlation between increases of ADHD, attention deficit disorders, and the decrease in play, in free play time that has been seen in places like the United States and the United Kingdom. So cultivating play, both for the opportunities, the educational opportunities it provides, and the ability to apply information to novel situations, but also just for a mental health reason. And play, of course, doesn't stop at early childhood, but it can be evolving throughout one's curriculum all the way into higher education, of course. Jonathan Dawson would have talked much more about the role of play in his classroom, through the incorporation of plays, incorporation of projects, creative projects. And there's a chapter in the book as well on the role of comics, on drawing comics, on story. The benefits of it is you can tell a sustainability story, you learn storytelling, artwork, collaborative work, and writing as well. And it's a real kind of holistic tool to teach and to provide a creative space to wrestle with sustainability challenges. Deep learning, as I already mentioned, for me, that really makes sense. The ability to learn, learn how to learn is essential. We can't just teach in the siloed ways where information doesn't apply to the other disciplines. And there is real opportunity to work through collaboration, through projects. These are images of youth working on different projects together, creating things, designing things, so that they can then apply that information and the skills of teamwork in other fields. In the deep learning, I would also mention this idea of systems thinking. It's a complement, I would say, where instead of just talking about the ability to learn and how to learn, or deeper learning, as two of our authors discuss, there's also the understanding that we need to understand how systems work and apply that understanding and framework into all of our classes. And Linda Booth Sweeney, who's the chapter on systems thinking author, she makes it clear that this can be applied not just in the sciences, but in history and in English, you name it. Systems thinking can be incorporated into any discipline. And coming back to life skills, again, for me, I feel like this is critically important. There is a chapter specifically on home economics, as that is so essential, just to have the ability to know how to prepare food, how to grow food ideally, and how to cook. When you don't have those skills, you are beholden on the consumer culture completely. One doesn't understand anymore cooking one's own food. Then the increase in packaged food consumption is going to increase, and so is the obesity epidemic. And then, so it's bad immediately on the sustainability side, but it's also bad on the resilience side, where if we're not having that information and crises like a big global drought or what have you hit, and there is no more food on the shelves of the grocery store, or things become much harder to buy, and that's happened throughout history. That's not some scary kind of doom and gloom scenario. I mean, Venezuela right now, you can do a whole case study on it. But I think by not having the knowledge of how to prepare food, forage food, sometimes I think there is a value to that. But also just kind of make do and be thrifty, like we used to always learn in school. That's a real failing of the education system. But it doesn't have to just be kind of that level of basicness. I mean, there are great schools like the Bamboo School in Thailand, where social entrepreneurship is the core driver, the core driving principle of the entire school philosophy, right? So children are learning how to be social entrepreneurs and take those skills back to their villages around Thailand. So some are learning farming and innovative farming skills, right? Like, for example, they grow limes out of season so that they can sell them at a premium. So they've figured out how to prompt the lime trees to grow at different times than the norm, and really creative things like that. But also, as this picture shows, designing solar lighting kits for sale in villages and recharging of phones. So there's a real kind of creativity that has been built into this training around life skills. And a third life skill that gets its own chapter is on comprehensive sexual education. It's sadly a taboo topic in this country, but unfortunately in countries like the Netherlands, it's normalized so that children from 5 years of age, from preschool, are getting age-appropriate sexual education. So they understand what type of touching is okay and what kind is not. So they understand the basics around biology and sex and all of that at age-appropriate levels. And so that there is not a high teen pregnancy rate like in the US or higher levels of sexually transmitted diseases. And as the author Bob Engelman and Mona Keidley note, so that there is a fuller joy around the sexuality that is a natural part of being alive, a natural part of being human. So comprehensive sexuality education, again, it will improve human well-being as well as improve sustainability by stabilizing population, by preventing unwanted pregnancy, and so on. So that's, again, another win-win there to incorporate into education. And finally, going back to the pinnacle on Earth-centric leadership, that's, at one level, it could be almost a bubbling up of all the other 5 elements that this, if you're teaching those other 5, there's a, Earth-centric leadership will stem naturally out of those. But as well, I would argue, just like with character education, we'd want to cultivate that naturally, intentionally. And some schools, like the Bamboo School in Bali, really do incorporate that Earth-centric leadership directly into their curricula and encourage the students to start projects, like 2 sisters there who started a petition and broader campaign to ban plastic bags in Bali, and succeeded. I mean, incorporating lots of different strategies, petitions, hunger strike, and many other elements. And when you actually have teachers, have a school administration that's encouraging, not just greening around the edges. This is not, we're not talking about encouraging all students to recycle anymore. That's far, far from enough of a sustainability message for students. Instead, we have to really cultivate full leadership in working towards stopping the damage, working towards restoring the planet, and getting us ready now, unfortunately, for the sustainability challenges to come. So let me pause there. That's the kind of the broader Earth Ed kind of framework that we really use to shape our research and work. And then we can take a quick question. If anyone has burning questions, let's say it that way, that they want to start with now, I'd love to answer them, and then we can go on to higher education.
Erik, it's Ira. I did get several comments in the chat box, none of them necessarily disagreeing with your framework or your Venn diagram, but maybe best to say looking for a little bit more detail or your rationale. As I'm sure you're aware, there are a lot of us out there who have a soft spot for sustainability lexicon. There are just as many who don't particularly like sustainability terminology and welcome anything that could help clarify it, including resilience terminology. But I'm combining three different comments here in basically asking what is it that resilience adds to sustainability that you think is necessary for that fuller, more comprehensive approach. Another one that says, isn't it simply a matter of having a complete understanding of what sustainability really is or fully defining sustainability properly? And another person asks, you refer to the resilience of the students. Did I catch that correctly? Or are you talking about the resilience of the planet and communities as well as the students? Help me here. So they're all kind of interrelated.
Sure. No, those are great questions. Thank you. Yes, of course, the resilience of the communities, societies, the schools too, and the students. But I think, what does resilience add? I think it needs to be there. One, because there is increasing conversation around resilience. And my biggest fear of not engaging with the term resilience is that it takes over from the conversations around sustainability. And if we pursue resilience without sustainability, I'd argue that that is the worst case scenario, right? Because if we keep making this completely unsustainable society more resilient, then the damage will pile up, and the crash, when it comes, will be even worse than it already is going to be. And then the other reason is because there is no preventing massive ecological changes from affecting our 9.5 billion people, right? Unless the crash comes earlier than I'm expecting, or I don't know, not hoping, but if it, we might not get up to 9.6 billion, but we certainly are heading towards that. And so we have to accept that the conversation in the sustainability community has to change, right? The idea that we can shift over to renewable energies and still have a Western way of life is completely naive. And it's hard not to talk in those terms because we don't want to alienate our members as, as nonprofit campaigners or whatever you have. But the truth is, there are going to be massive changes. We're going to lose entire cities. We're going to lose places like huge parts of Florida over a certain period of time. That hopefully, if we're smart and pursue sustainability actively, that will be 200 years or 250 years rather than 50 to 100 years, because the faster all that happens, the more chaotic it'll be and the more violent it will be. But to not talk about how to make anybody who's willing to listen more resilient, right? To have basic skills, to have a variety of knowledge pathways at their fingertips, so that as systems change, they'll have options. That's the key thing we have to do, right? So students who don't get home economics, they'll be okay right now. They don't really need to know how to cook. They can go down to the local grocery store and buy a frozen pizza, and they'll be okay in the short term. I would argue that they'll increase their levels of obesity and heart disease risks and diabetes and all that. But that's still within the realm of okayness. But when, as I said, when grocery stores no longer have the variety of foodstuffs that we've gotten used to, and we're going to have to work a lot harder to secure our calorie counts, having those skills are going to mean the difference between poverty and sufficiency. So is that the same as saying a more complete understanding of sustainability? Unfortunately, I think sustainability is so Brundtlandy, the needs of the future and all of that, the resilience isn't really incorporated into there. We assume that the Earth is stable in that definition, and that we just have to better focus our needs so that the needs of the future are able to be met. But the Earth system is changing, so the needs of the future are, providing for the needs of the future are going to be even harder, because biocapacity is way over utilized, and as systems change, and as the planet can't grow as much food because of increasing temperatures, then ability to meet those needs are even lower. So we have to start thinking actively about resilience, but not at the cost of sustainability. Hence the Venn diagram, where we're talking about both actively and ideally in ways that reinforce each other.
Great response, Eric. Why don't we proceed to the second component of your presentation, and we'll come back for more Q&A at the end.
Great. All right. So let me just talk then a little bit about higher education. Just as we tried to really rethink more broadly, this idea around how education could look like, we wanted to zoom right in on higher education. And I think, the first chapter is by Michael Maniates, who really looks at what education for a post-growth world will look like, right? He makes some really important points that even if the university is based in the growth model and dependent on growing levels of contributions and building its campuses bigger to attract the best students and all of that, and so can't necessarily fully accept that we're moving to the post-growth world or even a significant contraction, they can at least start sowing the seeds for effectively figuring out the transition to that post-growth world. In other words, even for schools that are unwilling to divest from fossil fuels, as just one example, they can at least be funding projects or chairs in departments to figure out creative ways to adapt to the different scenarios that are coming out in the future, right? So job sharing is one of the examples Michael Maniates gives. Cooperatives, things like Evergreen, and other innovative ways of doing more with less, not more efficiently, but really thinking through growth and the post-growth era. Jonathan, of course, talks about bringing the classroom back to life and how teachers no longer should be just passing their wisdom to their students, but really figuring out ways to co-create educational experiences through multiple ways of learning, like hands-on curriculum, service learning. This is a photo of some of the students acting out in a good way in class. And the examples he gives are really inspiring, whether kind of nature walks and collaborative projects or drama in the classroom. So, and moving on, one of the other chapters is on vocational training. This is kind of expanding on the life skills piece of the life skills theme of the report, but this idea of vocational training for the eco-technical transition. And the author here really looks at three different components of this, or three different case studies, I guess I would say, on restorative agriculture, how we can really cultivate an agricultural set of knowledge, especially in community colleges. She really makes a case for, as the economy is contracting, as fewer and fewer students can afford a 4-year university opportunity, well, there can be more specific focused trainings on restorative agriculture, on carbon mitigation specialists, as she says, how do we redesign our current infrastructure in ways that actually reduces CO2 emissions and again makes us more resilient. And the third piece, which is not as obvious, is on conflict mediation, on recognizing that there will be an increase of conflict in the coming decades and century. And so how do we actually start training a crop of students or future leaders that can help manage that conflict? And one of, I think, my favorite chapters in the report is on sustainability education in prisons. This is not even, I would say, on the radar for many people. And unfortunately, of course, we're working from a place where there is a huge prison population or imprisoned population in the United States. But the authors make really powerful points about how in prisons, the inmates can really take huge leadership roles in learning about sustainability and actually furthering sustainability knowledge. Here on the left, you can see a male inmate who's showing off his vermicompost system, one of the largest, if I remember right, a huge system. I can't remember the exact size, but one of the biggest in an institution like this, and people from around the world are actually coming to learn from him on how he's developed and maintains the system. On the right is a female inmate who's actually actively pollinating, using moths to pollinate. And again, I mean, some of these inmates are writing journal articles, are contributing to the deeper scientific language, and are mentoring each other, teaching each other, even across typical prison divides, different gangs and all of that. So there's a real healing role, there's a real educational and again vocational opportunity role, but as well there's one of the other points that the author makes is that there is a real opportunity to expand the diversity of the environmental movement. The fact that we have this divide, well, even the environmental justice versus the environmental movement, the fact that that even exists is an issue, but the opportunity to diversify the movement and provide a much kind of broader set of knowledges and experiences that can help influence and shape the movement is a really powerful kind of additional point that the author makes. And then we have a series of chapters, 5 chapters on specific disciplines, right? On ecological economics and how do we shift the economics to a more earth-based system, agricultural sciences, engineering, business school, and medical school. And I won't go into all these unless people want to ask about them specifically in question and answer period. But I mean, I'll just focus on the medical school for a moment, where this was a really challenging kind of chapter to even identify an author, but also then for the author to really find some concrete examples of medical schools integrating sustainability into their curricula. And it's surprising, really. I mean, if you really look systemically, look holistically at the health challenges that we face, much of which are driven by overconsumption, whether that's and social isolation, which is a side effect, I'd argue, of that consumerist path. You have a real dependency on antidepressants. You have the obesity epidemic, which I mentioned, and so many maladies that come from that: heart disease, diabetes, several types of cancers. And of course, there's the deeper system problem of all the marketing that's normalizing all of this. But the fact that medical schools aren't finding ways to address the sustainability challenges, other environmental challenges, like as the environment changes, new diseases come out of the disruptions in whether forests, ecosystems, or what have you. So there's a real lack of leadership in medical schools on digging into the sustainability questions and the resiliency questions. So the author really, I think, grapples with that effectively. And the final piece of the puzzle, I think, with this project and with Earth Education, in my mind, is really looking ahead, right? So the final chapter is on the future of education, a glimpse from 2030. And we tried to really look at where Earth education could go, or sustainability education, or environmental education, if that's the term you'd like better, where an Earth-centric education could bring us. And we kind of drew scenarios looking at forest schools and how that could really be expanded and ramped up. We looked at kind of offshoots of those. I call it a river school, inspired by this. This is an image of a Nigerian floating school, a real one, dismantled now because it started to fall apart, and they're building a newer, stronger model now. But they built this community built this floating school because of the flooding that they were regularly experiencing. It was preventing children from going to school. So they said, well, why don't we just build a floating school instead? And I would argue that you could not only just build a floating school, and that was the end goal, but you could actually make that floating school into a forest school equivalent, a river school that allows for new opportunities. It could be floating up and down the river, exploring different ecosystems that are still intact along the coast. There could be a fishery or a fish farm embedded into the school, so children could learn the vocational knowledge around raising fish, and so on and so forth. The sciences, you could have solar panels on the rooftops so that the children could be learning how to manage and maintain solar panels and the battery banks and all of that. But just so much opportunity when we think holistically about school design, and so we really tried to kind of whet readers' appetites in a sense of where schooling could go if we really thought creatively about the challenges that we're going to face in this next century and beyond, and how we could use schools to truly prepare students to be both sustainability leaders and resilient leaders that can help adapt their communities, their societies to the challenges to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. There are a handful of questions, and we've got plenty of time to handle them as long as you're willing to stay with us. So the first is fairly direct, recognizing that you were not the author of the specific chapters. Is there anything that you can share as the highlights of the business and engineering chapters in particular?
Sure. On the engineering chapter, it was a really interesting chapter, in part because the authors made it clear of the engineering challenges ahead, right? So we have such a growth in population. We have such a growth in the number of cities that are getting bigger, but also just new cities. So we're going to need massive increases in the ranks of engineers. And he makes that point clear, and especially in developing countries where the numbers are fewest, and yet the need is the greatest. And so he raises that point. He raises the bigger point of how, and yet we don't just need more engineers, but we need engineers that understand the sustainability challenges that those cities will be facing in increasing sea levels and increasing droughts and all of that. And also makes very clear points of the benefits of increases in diversity of engineering students, in more women engineering students, more students from around the world, and so on. So it's a very strong chapter on kind of broadly drawing out the challenges ahead, but as well as the opportunities to rethink engineering so that sustainability challenges are directly embedded in this engineering curricula. And as far as business school, again, I mean, I guess I would never, as the editor of the report, say any chapter is bad, but this is a very good chapter on business education, and really looks at kind of the evolution in business education that's happening, but that needs to happen faster, as he points out. So there's business education 1.0, which is where we are, which is how do we make business more sustainable as we pursue the unsustainable ends of business, versus business education 2.0, how do we fully integrate sustainability to the core of business, which is not happening right now, obviously. So it's a real, and then doesn't just kind of point that optimistic description, but really ask those questions of how do we keep teaching business education 1.0 well, so that the students can actually find jobs in these unsustainable businesses and help to change them, but also then integrate the business education 2.0 at the same time, which is going to be obviously a very challenging path to walk down.
From a different attendee, simply the comment picking up on the title of one of your slides, Rethinking Specific Disciplines. The comment is hope that you and or Worldwatch will do more with helping specific disciplines rethink themselves, and anything in the works. The question ends. Are you contemplating any follow-on activity relating to rethinking specific disciplines?
It's a great question. We don't have, there was a moment where we were trying to create an Earth Ed catalyst network where we could bring together a variety of environmental educators or educators who value the sustainability, but much more challenging, especially finding funding than I had hoped. So it's a terrible answer, but so much of our work is sadly shaped by funding questions. So if that reality changes, I would love to expand this project ever more and really get it out there and start working actively with educators to take this model to the next level, if that so merits, and really keep the conversation going. But I also think that will depend on what the year brings. Ira hasn't mentioned yet, but I mean the book hasn't officially launched. On April 20th, we'll have a kind of a global launch where we'll launch it in Appalachian State, but everyone can watch online through a live stream as well. And we'll have several of the authors, actually about I think 7 or 8, joining us to talk about their chapter specifically.
We have another comment here, and this is sort of a list of different topics that come up in Earth Ed related discussions. Well, actually, I now have a revised version of the question coming in. How do we truly do interdisciplinary work, and what would it look like? One role I rarely hear mentioned for academics is the creator of new knowledge. How do we get back to that?
That's, I mean, maybe I go back to Michael Mann-Eighth's chapter where, I mean, this idea, there is a lot of lock-in at the university level, right? We have our silos and we have our disciplines and we have certain things that are taboo, right? We can't always question things that are directly, that we're directly dependent on, whether that's funding if you're in a bio or a pharmacology program from pharmaceutical companies, right? Even though there is a conflict there, that's probably not going to change anytime soon. But the university has flexibility in creating new experiments, right? That's what Mann-Eighth was trying to hammer across in his chapter. And I think maybe that's the first step. I mean, there are some universities and colleges that are, can be praised immediately for their interdisciplinary designs already, like the College of the Atlantic, for example, but for those that aren't there, there's opportunity, I think, to try to find spaces to collaborate interdisciplinarily, whether that's bringing people together yourself or trying to raise a grant to do that, or we're just offering special courses on that. So, I mean, that's a very vague answer, but I mean, I think that's up to the individuals who are there embedded in a university. That I mean, there are ways that you could cultivate a more interdisciplinary, whatever it is that you're excited about, research path, course, club. I mean, I think there's opportunities in all of them.
I think that was an appropriate note to end on. I want to thank you again, Erik, for sharing this overview of the forthcoming State of the World report, Earth Ed, Rethinking Education on a Changing Planet. As Erik just mentioned, there is the global launch coming up in just 10 days on a separate webinar feed. I urge you to Google that. Go to the Worldwatch website. I'm sure there's a link there, and join Erik and several of his authors for the global launch of this year's State of the World report. For the rest of you, I've mentioned our upcoming SCC webinars and our conference at the end of June. I hope you'll visit our website and learn more about that. And we are hopeful that Erik and Worldwatch will join us in June in Philadelphia at the faculty conference for the Sustainability Curriculum Consortium. With that, we'll sign off for today. Thanks again, Erik.
Thank you, Ira, and thank you everyone for joining.